The desert of New Mexico holds secrets. It's a place of immense beauty and profound emptiness, where the past is never truly buried. Sometimes that pushes its way back to the surface. On February 2nd, 2009, that's exactly what happened. And it started with a dog walk. It was an ordinary day for Christine Ross. She and her dog Ruka were out for a walk on the West Mesa, a rapidly developing area on the western edge of Albuquerque. The area was slotted for development the past few years, but building was canceled due to the housing market crash the year before. Regardless, it was definitely a landscape in transition, where the raw desert was giving way to the neat cul-de-sacs of suburbia. As they walked along an earthen trail, Ruka, doing what dogs do, started digging at something in the dirt. It was a bone, bleached by the sun, protruding from the dry soil. Christine felt in her gut that something was wrong. She doubted the large bone was from a cow or coyote. So trusting her instinct, she took a picture with her phone and sent it to her sister, who was a registered nurse. The reply that came back would change everything. Her sister was direct. The bone looked like a human femur. Christine immediately called the Albuquerque Police Department. When officers arrived, their initial assessment confirmed the horrifying suspicion. The bone was human. Who did it belong to? How did it get there? And were there more bones to be found? Before we get into those basic questions, though, let's ask an even more basic one. Why does this case matter so much? Well, for one, it's a scenario that touches on a universal fear. The ground beneath our feet, the land we build our homes on, can hold the darkest of secrets. West Mesa wasn't some forgotten wilderness. It was the backyard for a new community, a place where families were supposed to feel safe. On a personal level, this story has gripped me for years. I lived in Alamogordo, New Mexico from 2004 to 2008, and I often visited Albuquerque during that time. For over a decade, the West Mesa mystery has fascinated and horrified me, as it has many others who lived in New Mexico at the same time. It hits close to home, and it raises a question that sticks with you. How could something like this happen, essentially in our own backyards, without anyone noticing? Today, as a former resident of New Mexico, I want to share this case with the respect and gravity the victims deserve, keeping them at the center of the narrative. After that first gruesome discovery, the area near 118th Street and Dennis Chavez Boulevard was immediately sealed off for further investigation. While it was pretty clear the bone was human, authorities were hoping it was ancient. At first, the media coverage was mild. Just a story about some discovered bones on the front page of the Albuquerque Journal on February 7, 2009. Police spokesperson John Walsh shared that the police were still unaware about the age of the bones. So he tried to calm fear by pointing out the age could run the gamut from a rancher's grave to recently buried the last few years to ancient. But as the investigation grew, so too did the community interest. By February 10th, the public was made aware of two new alarming details. Not only were the original bones identified by dental records to be a woman who went missing in the area between 2003 and 2004, but bones from two more women had been uncovered in the same area. By February 12th, police admitted it was likely that the three women had been placed in the area by the same person, but they cautioned it was far too early to say it was the work of a serial killer. However, investigators realized they were effectively excavating an outdoor mass grave that was clandestinely used over a period of several years. The area was massive, roughly 92 acres, or about 70 football fields, where bones were scattered and buried in multiple shallow graves. A task force of detectives was quickly assembled. At one point, up to 40 officers, detectives, and FBI agents were on the case, all determined to recover every victim and every piece of evidence from this desert boneyard. Quote, "It was a case everybody wanted to solve," recalled former Albuquerque Police Chief Michael Geyer. The task force used everything at their disposal: cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, satellite images. Standard police evidence collection wasn't enough. This required archaeological precision. They brought in forensic anthropologists and archaeologists from the Office of the Medical Investigator to help carefully dig and document the site. Heavy machinery was used to remove topsoil, and then teams of technicians sifted through the dirt by hand, flagging even the smallest of bone fragments. Quote, "We worked with the archaeologists to painstakingly excavate the bodies. It was a huge, huge crime scene," Chief Geyer said, describing the slow, methodical process. Some of the skeletal remains were incomplete or intermingled due to erosion and animal activity, which made the forensic work even harder. By Valentine's Day 2009, remains of yet another woman had been found, but the story was still developing quickly. By the end of that week, the front page story of the Albuquerque Journal was the Southwest Mesa body search. 6 bodies had been found by then, but Chief of Police Ray Schultz was quick to announce the task force already had an extensive list of suspects, including one who was already dead. The article went on to share more information about the burial site. Between 2003 to 2005, the area was described as a barren desert. However, in the mid-2000s, there had been plans to build new homes right where the bodies were buried. In fact, before the housing market collapse in 2008 halted development, construction crews had already disturbed part of the burial area without even realizing it. A retaining wall for a planned subdivision had been built to control flooding, and that construction might have inadvertently unearthed some bones, bringing them closer to the surface. It's also possible that disruption was part of the reason for the scattering of some of the bones. It's a cruel twist of fate, or maybe a stroke of luck, that the economic downturn paused the construction. If houses had been built on land quickly, the graves might have been permanently covered up and lost. Instead, open land and erosion left just enough traces for Christine Ross's dog to sniff out. It's sobering to think a real estate bust led to a break in a serial murder case. The headline on February 24th was the most shocking yet. Body count at 10. The West Mesa site was officially the largest crime scene investigation in Albuquerque's history, according to Chief Schultz. Sadly, though, only one victim was identified by that point, Victoria Chavez. In her memory, loved ones erected a small memorial along the edge of the retaining wall at the site. It was quickly becoming apparent to the task force that finding the remains was only the first of many challenges. The next was giving the women back their names. Years had passed since they were killed, and the desert had stripped away almost everything. As Dirk Duran Gibson, author and professor at the University of New Mexico, would put it, there was almost nothing but bones. For each set of bones, forensic experts turned to DNA testing, dental records, and any distinguishing features to put a name to the remains. For the families of missing individuals awaiting news, it was an agonizing process. Day after day, local news stations and newspapers showed images of detectives and archaeologists combing over the mesa under the cold winter sun. Families who'd reported missing loved ones years earlier were now asked to provide DNA samples or dental records for comparison. Bit by bit, the list of names was emerging. By February 28th, the news reported that 13 bodies had been found at the site. The term serial killer was now being used in the press, although the police department was still cautioning against the term, most likely trying to avoid a public panic. That first month of the case, only one other person had been identified officially. Michelle Valdez's family had been notified that her remains were identified. One of the 13 bodies belonged to Michelle's unborn child. By mid-March, 2 more families had been given the devastating news that their loved ones weren't coming home. Julie Nieto, who had disappeared in July of 2004 when she was just 24, was a mother devoted to her young son. Her aunt had known something terrible must have happened to her when she stopped sending Christmas and Easter gifts to him. Quote, even at her lowest point, she would never leave her son, the aunt said. The other woman identified was Cinnamon Elks, 32, who disappeared just a month after Julie had. Investigators were starting to notice a pattern. All of the women so far shared a similar lifestyle, by making money on the streets, and many of them also dealt with addiction at some point. The Saturday, April 4th edition of the Albuquerque Journal shared the names of 2 more identified women, Monica Candelaria and Veronica Romero. They had lived very similar lifestyles to the rest. However, there was a little more to go on in Monica's case. She'd been reported missing on May 24, 2003, and the sheriff's department had worked on her disappearance for 6 months. The case went cold with a haunting rumor. Associates told police they believed she'd been killed and buried on the mesa. By late 2009, authorities had confirmed the identities of a total of 11 victims, plus the fetus, ranging in age from 15 to 32. The original reports of 13 bodies turned out to be incorrect when all remains had been identified. But before we continue following the investigation, we need to rewind. People don't go missing for years without there being a trail. Police reports, grieving families to note their absence. Years before the West Mesa graves were uncovered, women had been quietly vanishing from Albuquerque streets. Between 2001 and 2005, a pattern emerged that few had noticed at first. Numerous young women, many of them Hispanic, in their teens or 20s, went missing without a trace. Most of the women struggled with addiction and had turned to the streets to survive, which sadly meant their disappearances drew little public attention. And after only working on this channel for less than a year, it's a pattern we've seen multiple times before. Women on the streets are incredibly vulnerable, but when they disappear, their cases seem to be under-investigated. But each of these missing women is important. As Albuquerque Police Detective Ida Lopez would later insist, quote, "These women were loved. Each one has a unique story, and their families want answers." One of those stories is especially heartbreaking. Jamie Borrella was only 15 years old, just a high school girl when she went missing in 2004. She'd gone to a local park one afternoon with her 27-year-old cousin Evelyn Salazar. Both of them just never came home. Jamie's mother would later recall her daughter left the house so casually that day she didn't even turn off her curling iron, so she obviously expected to be back soon. Instead, Jamie and Evelyn vanished, leaving their family frantic and perplexed. For years, Jamie's mother Jane waited for any news, fearing the worst. Quote, "They won't even contact us. Nothing. Whatever I hear through the grapevine," end quote, Perez would say of those agonizing years with no answers. It wasn't until months after that grisly discovery on the Mesa in 2009, 5 years later, that Jamie and Evelyn's fate became known. They were found buried together among the other West Mesa victims. Jamie was the youngest of the 11, and yet, like the others, her life was stolen by a killer who preyed on society's most vulnerable. Many of the West Mesa victims did have troubled lives and dangerous jobs, but their lives still had value. Consider Michelle Valdez, 22, who had a young daughter and was 4 months pregnant when she was killed. Her father, Dan Valdez, recalls his bright, beautiful girl. Quote, "When Michelle walked into a room, it lit up. Her smile was beautiful, and I want everyone to know she was a beautiful person." End quote. Another victim, Doreen Marquez, 24, was a mother of 2 little girls. Doreen had been an attentive, loving mom until addiction derailed her life. Her family remembers her as an amazing woman. Her daughter Destiny wrote in 2009, quote, "I thought she was so beautiful and I always wanted long, gorgeous hair like hers." End quote. Then there was Victoria Chavez, 26, an outgoing nature lover who adored hiking and camping. Her mother would tearfully wonder, quote, "How could one person do this to 11 girls?" End quote. Veronica Romero, 28, was smart, funny, and tough, according to her boyfriend. But one night in 2004, he dropped her off on Central Avenue for work. He watched her get into a pickup truck and never saw her again. These brief glimpses into the victims' lives show that each woman was more than a statistic or a label. They had families, children, dreams, and struggles. By late 2005, enough women were missing that Detective Ida Lopez grew alarmed. Working in APD's Missing Persons Unit, Lopez had started compiling a list of women who disappeared under similar circumstances, in hopes of spotting a pattern. She eventually had 24 names on her list of missing women from 2001 to 2006. This was too many to be a coincidence in a city like Albuquerque. Detective Lopez suspected these cases could be connected, maybe the work of a serial killer, but she lacked proof. At the time, her warnings didn't spur urgent action. As a reporter from Vice later noted, to many in the police department, it was dismissed as nothing but a list of missing hookers. The cruel reality is that missing persons who are poor, transient, or involved in work tend to receive less attention. Criminologist Dr. Stephen Egger calls them the less dead. Victims society treats as if they're less alive to begin with, because they're marginalized individuals. Dr. Egger explains that there's an attitude that reduces pressure on the police to solve the crime, at least until the body count grows. Detective Lopez's list was an early red flag, but it took the discovery of the bodies on the Mesa to make everyone finally realize a serial killer had been hunting women in their city. For the families of these missing women, the years before 2009 were filled with anguish. They filed missing persons reports, put up flyers, pleaded for help, often to little or no avail. Because many victims led high-risk lifestyles, some families felt authorities didn't prioritize their cases. Jane Perea, the mother of Jamie, lamented that, quote, "They just threw them out there like nobody cares. It doesn't matter what they were doing. They were human beings. Somebody's daughter." The pain and frustration in that statement underscores the stakes. These women mattered, and their loved ones desperately needed answers. That's what makes the discovery of the West Mesa graves both devastating, but in a sad way, also validating. It proved the families and Detective Lopez were right all along. Something terrible had happened to their daughters, sisters, and mothers. Now at last, in 2009, The truth was being dragged into the light of day. When the remains were all finally identified, 9 or 10 of the women on Detective Lopez's list were confirmed to be among the dead. But who was the monster preying on women in Albuquerque? And would the investigation be able to finally bring him to justice? Well, the investigation was just at the beginning, and already it was tough going with little to go on. After identifying the women, the medical examiner couldn't pinpoint exact causes of death for any of them. The official cause for all 11 was listed as homicidal violence. In other words, these women were certainly murdered, but decomposition erased the telltale signs of how. Cold case detective Liz Thompson noted in a 2022 briefing that these women weren't shot. There was no evidence of blunt force trauma, which complicates the case and makes it harder to solve because we don't have any clear indicators of what caused their deaths. This led investigators to suspect the killer's MO may have been strangulation or suffocation, methods which can kill without leaving marks on bone. In essence, the killer left behind just bodies with precious little physical evidence. After all those years, the crime scene held few clues beyond the remains themselves. There was no clothing with the remains, no personal belongings, no weapon, and no obvious DNA from a perpetrator at the burial site. Investigators did make one intriguing find, a plastic tree tag buried in the dirt near one of the victims. The tag bore the name of a local nursery that sold plants and trees. Police tracked the tag to a batch of trees sold around 2005, and this would later factor into suspicions about a particular suspect who had a landscaping habit. Detectives also scoured the area for tire tracks and footprints. While tire marks were visible in old satellite images from 2004, by 2009 those tracks were long gone. Albuquerque's dry desert climate and occasional construction in the area had effectively wiped the canvas clean. This lack of evidence meant that initially the only connection between the 11 victims was the manner in which they were found, together in a serial dumping ground, and the high-risk lifestyle most of them shared. Despite the lack of forensic leads, the magnitude of the crime spurred law enforcement to pour resources into the case early on. They called it the 118th Street Homicide Investigation, but the press soon dubbed the unknown perpetrator the West Mesa Bone Collector due to the eerie, grisly nature of the supposed trophy field. Given the victimology, profilers believe the killer was likely someone who operated around the sex trade in Albuquerque, someone who could approach these women without raising alarm. The perpetrator could have into the streets where these women worked, maybe posing as a John. Albuquerque's main track for sex work is along Central Avenue on the east side of the city. It's an area known for prostitution, drugs, and crime. One victim's boyfriend described that area as, quote, literally like Walmart for vices. Every single day and night, the people circling around it are either prostitutes, Johns, dealers, or cops. Within a busy and dangerous group, a serial killer could potentially troll for victims without immediately drawing attention, and that's exactly what appears to have happened. The stakes were enormous. A predator, or predators, had gotten away with murdering 11 women, and the clock was already past the critical window for catching him. As Chief Geyer would later put it, by the time the bones were found, quote, we were behind the power curve by 3 years or more. As investigators built their timeline, they realized the disappearances seemed to stop around 2006. This was a critical clue. It suggested the killer was no longer active. Was he in prison? Had he moved away? Or was he dead? This last possibility led them to their first, and for a long time, their strongest person of interest, a man named Lorenzo Montoya. The circumstantial evidence against Montoya was overwhelming. He lived in a trailer park less than 3 miles from the burial site. In 2006, there were even dirt trails that reportedly led directly from his neighborhood to the remote area on the mesa where the women were found. Indeed, detectives even found tire tracks in old satellite photos that led from the burial site toward Montoya's residence, strengthening the circumstantial case against him. Montoya, a pressman at a local printer, had a documented history of violence against women, particularly escorts. He'd been arrested twice for violent attacks, and had once threatened to kill his girlfriend and bury her in lime. More damningly, former coworkers told police that Montoya had openly talked about killing women and burying their bodies on the West Mesa. Then came the events of December 2006. Montoya met a 19-year-old sex worker named Sherika Hill in an online chat room and lured her to his trailer. There he strangled and killed her. But Sherika Hill wasn't alone that night. Her boyfriend Frederick Williams had followed her to Montoya's trailer. As Montoya was attempting to drag Hill's body to the trunk of his car, Williams confronted him. Williams shot and killed Lorenzo Montoya. After Montoya's death, the disappearances of women from Albuquerque streets stopped. To investigators, this was a powerful indicator. The timeline fit perfectly, but the most chilling piece of evidence was found inside his trailer. Police searched his property and vehicles for any link to the Mesa burials. They discovered a videotape in Montoya's possession that was disturbing. Footage of Montoya engaging in sex with a woman who appeared unconscious or dead, and then audio of duct tape being ripped and a garbage bag being opened. Sounds consistent with wrapping a body for disposal. Screenshots of the woman in the tape were released to the public in hopes of identifying her, fearing she too could be a victim of Montoya's violence. It certainly seemed like Montoya had a proclivity for murder. So a violent history, a proximity to the crime scene, a confession to coworkers, a timeline that fit, and a deeply disturbing home video. It seemed like the police had found their man. The West Mesa Bone Collector was a ghost, a dead man who could no longer harm anyone. But in a case this complex, nothing is that simple. Despite the mountain of circumstantial evidence, there was a fatal flaw in the case against Lorenzo Montoya. After his death, investigators conducted a thorough forensic search of his trailer, his vehicle, and his possessions. They were looking for a single hair, a fiber, a drop of blood, anything that could physically tie him to the 11 women buried on the mesa. They found nothing. Not a single piece of physical evidence connected Lorenzo Montoya to the West Mesa victims. As Geyer lamented, quote, "We would have liked Montoya to have been our main suspect and closed the case out, but with him being deceased, it limited our investigative capabilities." This is the immense challenge of prosecuting a cold case, especially when your primary suspect is deceased. Suspicion, no matter how strong, isn't proof. Without forensic evidence, a case cannot be legally closed. The man who seemed like the perfect suspect was, in the eyes of the law, a dead end, literally. So if the evidence didn't point conclusively to Montoya, investigators had to ask, was there someone else? Someone still alive? Police turned their attention to another man with a dark and violent history, Joseph Blea. In fact, police didn't have to look far for his name. Just 1 week after the first bone was discovered in 2009, Blea's own ex-wife called the police and told them he was someone they should investigate. Blea was already known to law enforcement. In the 1980s, he'd terrorized the neighborhood in Albuquerque, earning the nickname the Middle School Rapist, for a series of brutal attacks on teenage girls. For years, these cases went unsolved, until a DNA hit in 2010 finally linked him to one of the crimes. He's now serving a 90-year prison sentence for those and other sexual assaults. Like Montoya, the circumstantial evidence connecting Blea to the West Mesa victims was compelling. Police records showed he was frequently seen in the areas where the women worked and had over 130 contacts with police in the years before the bodies were found. One of his ex-wives said that he, quote, often speaks about his hatred for prostitutes, calling them dirty. Both of his ex-wives also mentioned that Blea would be gone late into the night, ostensibly to illegally dump waste from his landscaping business. His DNA was also found on the body of another woman of the night, Jennifer Lynn Sherm, who was murdered in 1985. He was never charged with that specific crime. While in prison, a cellmate allegedly told investigators that Blea had confessed to hiring the West Mesa victims, calling them trashy. A search of his home also turned up women's jewelry and underwear that didn't belong to his wife or daughter. But the most tangible piece of evidence was a small, seemingly insignificant object found near the burial site, that plastic plant tag from a nursery that I mentioned earlier. Investigators traced the tag back to a nursery that Blea, who worked in landscaping, was known to frequent. It was a tantalizing clue, a physical object that seemed to place a known predator at the scene of the crime. Investigators pored over thousands of receipts, trying to forge a definitive link between Blea, that nursery, and the time the women were buried. The single tag is a perfect illustration of the frustrating nature of this investigation. It was a breadcrumb that suggested a path, but it didn't lead to a final destination. Ultimately, police couldn't prove the tag belonged to Blea, or that its presence definitively connected him to the murders. There was another promising lead that dissolved under the harsh light of legal scrutiny. The existence of two strong but unprovable suspects has led to other theories. Some experts, like former University of New Mexico professor Dirk Duran Gibson, have suggested this might not be the work of a lone killer at all. He believes the murders could have been perpetrated by organized crime or a biker gang, and that the women were silenced because they knew something they shouldn't have known. Other theories abound. One points to a possible trafficking ring that operated throughout the Southwest, targeting vulnerable women during large events like the New Mexico State Fair. In August of 2010, police confiscated thousands of photos from photographer Ron Irwin, who reportedly was a regular at the New Mexico State Fair, but they later cleared him of any connection to the West Mesa murders. In 2010, police released images of at least 6 women who they asked the public to help identify or provide information about. The media at the time seemed to assume these were in some way connected to the West Mesa investigation, but that was never confirmed. Some of the women pictured were later found alive. Although not confirmed by investigators, convicted killer Scott Lee Kimball claims to have been asked questions about the crimes in Albuquerque. His name could have been raised for several reasons. First, he supposedly traveled through the area often for business prior to his arrest for murder in Colorado. He was arrested in 2006, which would explain why the West Mesa murders stopped. Also, there's the very tangential link that one of the West Mesa victims, Sylvania Edwards, had spent time in Denver's red light district prior to making her way south. Some amateur sleuths have even speculated about a link to the infamous human trafficker Jeffrey Epstein, who owned a large ranch in New Mexico, not far from Albuquerque. This seems unlikely to me because Epstein seems to have had younger tastes, to put it in a way that YouTube won't flag. And also, when I looked up the distance between the West Mesa burial site to Zorro Ranch, it's a drive of over an hour. However, if he was in any way connected with the West Mesa crimes, there could be more information coming soon. A New Mexico state lawmaker, Andrea Romero, plans to introduce a bill in January 2026 that would allow a deeper investigation of the Zorro Ranch property. But these are just theories. Just like with Lorenzo Montoya, there's never been enough evidence to charge anyone with the murders. The central question, who is the bone collector, remains unanswered, now tangled in a web of multiple suspects, conflicting theories, and a frustrating lack of proof. With all investigative avenues seemingly leading to dead ends, the final, lingering question becomes, can this case ever truly be solved? Chief Harold Medina, who as a young lieutenant helped with a grave excavation in 2009, is now APD's chief, and he has ensured the case remains open. Quote, "We've put a tremendous amount of effort into solving this case over the last 15 years, and we will not stop in the search for the individuals responsible," Chief Medina said on the 50th anniversary in 2024. The mayor of Albuquerque, Tim Keller, has similarly emphasized persistence and the need for public health. Quote, "Sometimes we don't have all the answers, but we're not going to quit. From my perspective as someone who lived in New Mexico during the years these murders happened, I find myself thinking, could I have crossed paths with the killer without knowing it? Albuquerque is only a few hours from Alamogordo, and I remember trips to that city, perhaps even driving near the West Mesa area. It's sobering to realize that while I was enjoying life in my 20s, going to concerts, just passing through Albuquerque, there were women disappearing in the shadows of that same city, and a murderer disposing of their bodies in a patch of desert overlooking the town. Did I ever drive past a lonely stretch of West Mesa, not knowing that just over the hill, 11 people of the community lay buried? After all this time, the West Mesa Bone Collector case remains unsolved, but not unsolvable. The victims' families and the community at large continue to seek closure, and there's good reason to believe that with persistence, this mystery can still be cracked. As we know, cold cases have been solved after even longer periods once witnesses came forward or DNA technology caught up with the evidence. The most fitting tribute we can give to the victims is to never give up on finding their killer. Mary Gutierrez, Victoria Chavez's mother, has spoken publicly for years, with her pain still raw. At one press conference, she recalled the moment she was told her daughter's remains were identified. Quote, "I was at work, and I told him, no. I was in denial. You got the wrong person." Her plea to us today is simple and heartbreaking. Quote, "Somebody out there knows something. Please come forward." If you have any information on the West Mesa murders or the missing women, please contact Albuquerque Police at 505-768-2450 or Crime Stoppers at 505-843-STOP. Every tip will be investigated. After roughly 1,500 tips already, it could be your call that finally brings justice. The echo on the West Mesa isn't one of a killer's victory, but of the lives he stole. It's the memory of Monica Candelaria, Victoria Chavez, Solania Edwards, Doreen Marquez, Veronica Romero, Jamie Barella, Evelyn Salazar, Virginia Clevin, Julie Nieto, Cinnamon Elks, and Michelle Valdez, and her child who never even had a chance to live. And it's a constant, quiet reminder of the 8 women who are out there, somewhere, waiting to be found. Years have passed. The raw desert where the women were found is now bordered by the quiet streets of a suburb. A memorial park stands as a quiet tribute, a place of remembrance. But for the families of these women, there's no peace. The lack of answers is a wound that I hope someday will be healed. If you believe we've earned it, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this content with your friends. As a small channel, viewers like you truly make a massive difference. Thank you. I'll see you in the next video.